Just days before this story broke, President Trump made a specific, public claim. He said both China and Russia had pledged not to sell arms to Iran, and warned that breaking that promise would carry serious consequences for Beijing and Moscow alike. It sounded, at the time, like a meaningful diplomatic win, proof that even Iran's most capable backers understood where Washington's red lines were drawn. Then, within days, that narrative collided with a very different set of facts. Reuters, citing multiple sources, reported that Iran is expected to receive its first shipment within weeks under a new contract, 300 to 400 Chinese-manufactured shoulder-fired missiles, valued at $60 to $70 million. The systems in question, the QW-12 and the FN-16, are not headline-grabbing weapons. They don't come with the prestige of a fighter jet or the range of a ballistic missile. But that, it turns out, may be exactly the point. So here is the contradiction this story forces us to confront. A stated pledge, repeated publicly by the President of the United States. And a documented arms shipment, moving forward regardless, from precisely the country that pledge was supposed to constrain. This isn't simply a story about a broken promise. Promises get broken in international politics more often than anyone would like to admit. What makes this different, and what deserves a much closer look, is not what China sent. It's how carefully this shipment appears to have been built to avoid ever being traced back to a broken pledge at all. Because if that's true, it says less about Iran's air defenses and more about how easily a great power can quietly work around its own commitments. Just days before this story broke, President Trump made a specific, public claim. He said both China and Russia had pledged not to sell arms to Iran, and warned that breaking that promise would be, in his words, very bad for whichever country did it. It sounded, at the time, like proof that Washington held real leverage over Iran's most capable backers, a red line even Beijing understood not to cross. Then, within days, a very different set of facts surfaced. Reuters, citing multiple sources and corroborated by other outlets, reported that Iran is already expected to receive its first shipment within weeks under a new contract, 300 to 400 Chinese-manufactured shoulder-fired missiles, valued at $60 to $70 million. The systems involved, the QW-12 and the FN-16, aren't headline weapons. They lack the range of a ballistic missile or the prestige of a fighter jet. That absence of spectacle, it turns out, may be exactly the point. So here is the contradiction worth sitting with. A pledge, stated publicly by the President of the United States. And a documented arms contract, apparently moving forward regardless, from precisely the country that pledge was meant to restrain. This is not simply a story about a promise being broken. Promises collapse in international politics more often than anyone likes to admit. What makes this moment different isn't the promise itself, it's how deliberately this shipment appears to have been built to avoid ever being traced back to it. To understand why Iran needed exactly this kind of weapon, we have to look back at what happened to its air defenses in the 5 months before this shipment was ever reported. To understand why this shipment matters, we need to establish exactly how we got here. The war itself began on February 28, 2026, when the United States and Israel launched coordinated airstrikes against Iran, killing Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei in the opening hours of the campaign. That single strike didn't end the conflict. It started a war that has since moved through repeated cycles of ceasefire and collapse, each one testing whether diplomacy could hold longer than the last. In April, a Pakistan-mediated pause offered the first real pass at de-escalation, but it didn't last. By June, the United States and Iran had gone further, signing a memorandum of understanding that reopened nuclear negotiations and promised to restore free passage through the Strait of Hormuz. For a moment, that agreement looked like genuine progress. Then, in mid-July, it unraveled entirely after Iran fired on commercial vessels moving through the strait, and Washington responded by resuming both airstrikes and its naval blockade. It's against this backdrop that the shipment itself needs to be understood. According to Reuters, the deal was arranged through a Hong Kong-based intermediary, Zhongqing Baoshang International Investment, with the weapons planned to move by air from Urumqi in western China, then overland through Pakistan into Iranian territory. This routing wasn't improvised. American intelligence had already flagged this exact pattern back in April, warning that Beijing was funneling shipments through third countries specifically to obscure their true origin. That detail changes how the story should be read. This wasn't a surprise Washington failed to anticipate. It was a warning Washington had already issued to itself months in advance. Which raises an uncomfortable question worth carrying into the next part of this story. If the pattern was identified that early, what made it so difficult to actually stop? To understand what made this shipment so difficult to stop, we have to go back further to what actually happened to Iran's air defenses once the war began. Tehran's own accounts claim substantial damage to advanced radar and missile defense infrastructure linked to American systems, including assets associated with THAAD and Patriot batteries. These are Iranian claims, not independently confirmed by the United States, and they should be treated with appropriate caution. But independent of that specific dispute, outside defense industry reporting converges on a related and less contested point. The opening strikes exposed genuine vulnerabilities across Iran's fixed, high-tier air defense network, the systems meant to shield missile bases, nuclear facilities, and other strategic infrastructure. What's more revealing is what didn't break down. Iran's lower-tier defenses, the cheaper and more mobile systems already dispersed across its territory, reportedly proved considerably more resilient, credited with shooting down several dozen American and Israeli aircraft and drones over the course of the conflict. That contrast wasn't lost on Iranian military planners. Expensive, radar-guided, fixed installations are comparatively easy for a technologically superior adversary to locate and destroy. Cheap, mobile, passive guidance systems are not. That single lesson, learned under fire, explains precisely why Iran went looking for exactly this category of weapon. It also reframes how China's role should be understood. Beijing's involvement in this war did not begin with the Manpads shipment. Throughout the conflict, China's public posture emphasized diplomatic mediation, even as the United States sanctioned Chinese companies over reported dual-use technology transfers and geospatial intelligence support to Iran, assistance that stopped short of confirmed, direct weapons deliveries. In other words, suspicion of Chinese support wasn't new. It had been building for months, tracked and documented well before this specific shipment ever came to light. That context matters enormously for how we read Trump's earlier statement about a Chinese pledge. He wasn't describing a clean, trusting relationship suddenly betrayed. He was describing a pledge extracted in the middle of an already suspected pattern of support, a promise layered on top of behavior Washington had reason to doubt from the start. Which means what came next wasn't simply a broken promise. It was the continuation of a trend that had been visible all along, just not yet this concrete. With that history in place, the real strategic story starts to come into focus, not merely what China sent, but why the method behind sending it exposes something Washington still hasn't fully adapted to. To understand what Washington actually failed to prevent, it helps to start with how modern air campaigns are designed to work in the first place. The core of contemporary air power doctrine is built around suppressing an adversary's integrated air defense system, locating and destroying the radar-guided, networked, high-value assets that require real infrastructure to operate and are, as a result, comparatively detectable. Against Iran's fixed defensive network, that doctrine performed exactly as intended. Radar sites, missile batteries, command infrastructure, the visible backbone of Iran's air defense, absorbed sustained damage precisely because it was built to be found. But the QW-12 and FN-16 systems reportedly moving toward Iran operate on an entirely different logic, and that difference is the whole point. These are passive infrared-guided weapons, with engagement ranges of roughly 6 kilometers and altitude ceilings under 4 kilometers. Critically, they emit no active radar signature before launch. There is nothing for a suppression campaign to detect, triangulate, or preempt. They are designed specifically to cover the low-altitude airspace around missile bases, nuclear sites, and other strategic infrastructure, precisely the coverage gap Iran's static, radar-dependent network failed to close. This is the first blind spot, and it is a tactical one. The doctrine that succeeded brilliantly against Iran's expensive, visible defenses is structurally, almost mechanically, poorly suited to detecting or preempting the cheap and invisible ones. That is not a failure of American resolve or firepower. It is a mismatch between a strategy built for one kind of target and a threat quietly built to avoid it. The second blind spot runs deeper, and it may ultimately matter more. This deal did not move through the visible architecture of state-to-state military transfers. According to Reuters sourcing, it was arranged through a Hong Kong-registered private intermediary, with the shipment itself planned to travel by air from Urumqi in western China, then overland through Pakistan into Iranian territory. This is precisely the kind of transfer that traditional sanctions monitoring and diplomatic pledges are poorly equipped to catch, commercial in form, deniable in structure, spread across multiple jurisdictions, and built around the plausible deniability that Beijing itself remains formally unimplicated, even when the hardware's origin is unmistakably Chinese. Here is what makes this particularly striking. Washington had already identified this exact pattern. Back in April 2026, American intelligence warned that China was routing shipments to Iran through third countries specifically to obscure their true origin. That means the July shipment wasn't a surprise in the conventional sense, it wasn't something nobody saw coming. It was something Washington had already seen coming months in advance, and still could not prevent. Foreseeing a threat and stopping it, it turns out, are two very different capabilities. This is where the contrast at the center of this story becomes unavoidable. The public narrative, reinforced directly by President Trump's own statement, held that a diplomatic pledge from Beijing functioned as genuine leverage, a red line China understood not to cross. The strategic reality, grounded in Reuters reporting and America's own prior intelligence warnings, is that state-level pledges simply do not reach into commercial intermediaries and third-country logistics chains built specifically to operate below that level. And there's a further irony buried in the timeline. The very success of the campaign against Iran's fixed air defenses is what raised the strategic value of cheap, mobile, deniable systems like these in the first place. These two blind spots don't stay contained to a single arms shipment. They're already shaping the trajectory of the war itself, and the effects reach far beyond Iran's borders. Start with the most immediate consequence. Reports already suggest that diminished American munitions stockpiles have started factoring into military decision-making, even as U.S. officials indicate a new wave of strikes could come within days. Layer a resupplied, low-altitude Iranian defense network on top of that reality, and the calculus shifts meaningfully. Every additional passive guidance system fielded across Iran's missile bases and strategic infrastructure adds density to exactly the kind of threat environment that's hardest to detect before an aircraft or drone is already committed to its flight path. That doesn't make the next wave of strikes impossible. It makes them measurably more costly, at precisely the moment munitions availability is already constraining what Washington can afford to risk. Widen the lens further, and the consequences stop being regional. Throughout this war, China has consistently avoided direct combat involvement, maintaining a public posture built around diplomatic mediation. This shipment, if it proceeds as reported, offers something more consequential than a single resupply, a working template. Deniable in structure, commercial in form, routed through third countries specifically to avoid direct implication. This is a model for exactly the kind of material support that lets a great power shape a conflict's outcome without ever accepting the label of combatant. Other states watching this war and future ones now have a demonstrated blueprint for how to do the same. There is also an economic dimension that shouldn't be overlooked, because it frames why this particular shipment matters so much to Tehran. The American naval blockade has reportedly cost Iran in the range of $500 million a day, with lost oil revenue estimated at $4.8 billion by early May alone. That is sustained, compounding economic pressure, layered on top of a war that has already produced thousands of documented casualties across Iran, Israel, the United States, and Gulf states caught in the crossfire. A country absorbing that level of economic strain has every incentive to seek defenses that are cheap, effective, and hard to trace back to a specific supplier, which is exactly what this shipment appears to offer. And then there's the diplomatic cost, which may prove the most durable consequence of all. The credibility of a state-level pledge depends on the assumption that it actually constrains behavior. This episode suggests otherwise. If a commitment from Beijing not to arm Iran can be technically maintained at the state level while being practically circumvented through commercial intermediaries and third-country logistics chains, then similar pledges from China, from Russia, from any other actor with comparable leverage become considerably harder to take at face value going forward. That's not a minor diplomatic footnote. It's a structural problem for how Washington negotiates restraint with rivals who have discovered a reliable way to promise one thing while enabling another. Put together, these four consequences reach well past a single documented shipment. This isn't just about Iran's air defenses anymore. It's a preview of how great powers may increasingly choose to shape wars they officially claim no part in, and that raises an unavoidable question about what happens from here. That question doesn't have a single answer yet, but it does have a set of realistic paths forward, each shaped by decisions already visible in how this story has unfolded. The first is the most immediate. U.S. officials have already signaled that a new wave of strikes could come within days, and one plausible path is that Washington simply proceeds on that timeline, striking before the Chinese shipment is fully integrated into Iran's defenses. This is a calculated bet on urgency. Accept the operational risk of acting now, against a still-forming threat, rather than face a denser, harder-to-detect low-altitude environment later. It trades near-term exposure for long-term advantage, assuming the window to act closes as more systems arrive. The second path shifts the fight away from the battlefield entirely and toward the supply chain itself. The Urumqi to Pakistan transit route and the Hong Kong-based intermediary aren't just details in a news report anymore. They're now documented intelligence. Washington could use that specific knowledge as a template for interdiction, working to intercept future shipments before they ever reach Iranian territory. This path tests something important: whether identifying a blind spot is enough to close it, or whether deniable, multi-jurisdictional transfers remain difficult to stop even once their exact route is known. A third path runs through diplomacy rather than confrontation. Iran currently insists it has no active negotiations with Washington beyond Oman-mediated talks focused narrowly on the Strait of Hormuz. But this war has already shown a repeating pattern since April: ceasefires collapsing, then reopening under pressure. The sustained economic toll of the blockade, combined with mounting casualties on multiple sides, could still push both parties back toward a renewed, if fragile, ceasefire framework, even from a starting point of open rejection. The fourth path involves no dramatic shift at all. China may simply continue operating exactly as it has: deniable, indirect, commercially routed support, calibrated to avoid direct implication as a combatant. From Beijing's perspective, the calculation may be straightforward. The reputational cost of eventually being caught is likely lower than the strategic value of keeping Washington's attention, resources, and military stockpiles tied down in a prolonged conflict with Iran. Each of these paths carries real risk. Continued strikes deepen the strain on already diminished American munitions stockpiles. Renewed fighting risks further casualties, not just for Iran and the United States, but for Gulf states that have already absorbed strikes during this conflict. But there are genuine opportunities as well. The newly documented transfer route is now actionable intelligence, not speculation. And the blockade's mounting economic pressure remains one of the few levers that has already, historically, pushed both sides back toward negotiation before. Whichever path unfolds, one fact won't change: the blind spot has already been mapped. The only question left is whether it gets closed or exploited again, and that question leads directly back to where this documentary began. So return, finally, to the contradiction this documentary opened with. A public pledge from Beijing, stated plainly by the President of the United States. And a documented, deniable shipment, apparently moving forward regardless, within days of that pledge being repeated. It would be easy to file this away as a simple broken promise, another example of a rival power saying one thing and doing another. But the evidence assembled here points somewhere more specific and more revealing. This is a story about two structural blind spots. A tactical one, in which air power doctrine built to destroy expensive, radar-guided defenses proved poorly suited to detecting cheap, passive, low-altitude ones. And an intelligence one, in which sanctions enforcement and diplomatic pledges, built around visible state-to-state transfers, proved poorly suited to catching commercial, third-country logistics chains built specifically to avoid them. What makes both blind spots so striking isn't that they went unnoticed. American intelligence flagged this exact transfer pattern months in advance. Neither blind spot has been closed. That is the deeper takeaway here. This was never really a story about Iran's resilience, or even about China's willingness to quietly work around its own commitments. It's a story about the distance between identifying a vulnerability and actually correcting it, a gap that persisted even with months of advance warning. With a new wave of U.S. strikes reportedly imminent, and this transfer route now fully documented rather than merely suspected, the coming weeks will offer a real test. Either Washington converts that awareness into action, or the same pattern repeats, with the next shipment, through the next intermediary, along the next route nobody was watching closely enough. The real test isn't whether Iran's new defenses hold. It's whether America closes a blind spot it already knew was there.